Greetings, fans, followers, and fellow gamers, to another episode of D20 Questions. Law here, ready to answer your questions about tabletop gaming. I would like to thank everyone who submitted more questions over the past week, and I would like to encourage some of our other fans to please, even if you have any kind of simple question, just submit them to d20question@gmail.com so I have more ammunition to feed into my question cannon. Let's start with a question from Benjamin Tennyson. He says, "Huge fan of D&D here, love the page, the humor, and the friendly admins." Oh, stop. My question is, do any of you run custom-style campaigns that aren't necessarily purely D&D? If so, what are ones that you have done? For instance, out of all the campaigns I have done, all of them have been custom down to the very races, all the way down to the classes. My current campaign is a hybrid of Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, Fire Emblem, and actual D&D. I try to keep it heavily based off the actual play of D&D, but sometimes it will be very loosely based off the actual format of the game. Time jump! Now, as for custom worlds, I myself run a world that I've been creating for over a decade, and I feel very comfortable running games in it because everything down to the history, to the NPCs' personalities, the government system, is of my design. I feel this is very common for a lot of GMs, especially ones starting out. Instead of going from a pre-made world, they want to design one of their own to have their own fantasy setting that they can bring to the table and let their friends play in it and kind of create it as they play each game. Now, I know I personally feel less confident running modules because I don't know the world as thoroughly as I do my own. Not to say it isn't a fun challenge to kind of figure out how the character should act in Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk or Eberron, but I feel like if there's any serious world changes that happen, I'm somehow breaking the history. That said, yes, there's a lot of detail I put into my own personal fantasy world. If you'll allow me to geek out for just a moment, I have several maps, I have a series of kingdoms, each with a different government system and a different money system. I even have a lunar calendar. And needless to say that after 10 plus years, it gets a lot of detail with all the games that have been run in it, because each time a party does things in a location, they change the history of that world. Now, I strongly encourage people to make worlds their own, and if that includes races or flavor from other games, especially video games, like Benjamin is using, that's fine, especially if your group is strongly in favor of that kind of thing. So great question. Our next question is from Cotton Mills. "Hello! I just wanted to say that was a very good start on your first video. Love the humor in it. Keep them coming. I intend to, with my fans' help. My question is this. What things, objects, have you used to create a more aesthetic, immersing dungeon, forest, etc. landscape? For instance, to create a more realistic forest, I have used the little trees that you can buy from the hobby shop for train sets. Just wondering if you have anything you like best or have seen before that really made the tabletop dungeon landscape experience better, or just plain cool. Handmade or bought. Thanks." I love this question because I am obsessed with miniatures and terrain. Now, I have also been collecting miniatures and terrain type pieces since I was about 15, and let's just say I have a pretty large collection. I would say as far as actual gaming miniatures go, it's somewhere in the thousands. I have shelves and drawers specially labeled with each different type of race, class, monster. I have pieces of terrain that I've collected and that I've made over the many years, and I feel like this is where there's a lot of crossover between tabletop wargaming like Warhammer or War Machine, things like that, where people actually make pawns and tower ruins or citadels out of debris. And you can incorporate these in the D&D game. The things that I've made that I particularly enjoy are train set trees, like you mentioned, using them as a forest to add a little more flavor. Certain castle walls, or things you can use as barricades or walkways, bridges. There's a company called Hearst Arts that sells plastic molds, and people buy these molds and then fill them with different kinds of plaster and sell the terrain that they make on eBay. And some of it is very inexpensive, anywhere from $1 to $5 for a series of dungeon walls, temple ruins, rocks, etc. So if you go on eBay and look up Hearst Arts, you'll find a plethora of things. For beginners, I suggest getting things like a few dungeon walls. Walls really help to kind of isolate the playing field and add some depth to the dungeons that you may run. And there are a ton of D&D tiles made by different companies used for dungeon cities, sewers, what have you. Now, it takes a lot of these tiles in order to actually make a very immersive dungeon, but there's always a good place to start. Now, there is a brand of dungeon tiles called specifically Dungeon Tiles made by D&D, and I really like it because it was very inexpensive. I believe I got it for around $11 on Amazon. And the box that it comes in can actually be used as tiers for a dungeon landscape. And it comes with all you need for really making a pretty immersive dungeon. You know, you'll have to make it room by room. You don't have enough to flesh the whole thing out. But I think it's a great start. And I highly suggest getting some sheets of black particle board, very cheap, and using sticky tack. In the past year, I have learned that sticky tack is a GM who is obsessed with miniatures and terrain's best friend, because you can make things stay in place. You can put miniatures on top of flying platforms to show that they're hovering off the ground without worrying about knocking them over, or you can construct bridges and things out of different... Now, I've made this egg pod out of a jar and some Sculpey. Sculpey is your other best friend. If you want to make terrain, you want to make scenery, and you're pretty crafty, then Sculpey is cheap, you bake it, and it lasts a long time. You can paint it however you want. So, excellent question, and I look forward on delving further into the world of miniatures and terrain in the future, as I am freaking obsessed. And our last question for the week comes from Daniel Keeper. What is your opinion of the Dragonfire Adept class? Do you think that it's overpowered? How do you feel about the Dragonborn as a race in 5th edition? What do you think is the most powerful class/race choice? Well, Daniel, I personally don't like to try to pick out which race is the strongest, and one of the nice things about 5th edition is they're all very balanced. I don't honestly feel that one is more powerful than the others, unless you're talking about a specific class build. Obviously, things that get a bonus to Charisma are going to make better Warlocks, and things that get a bonus to Strength or Dex are going to make better Fighters, Rogues, and Rangers. That's pretty common sense. Now, the Dragonfire Adept. This is a class from 3rd edition / 3.5 from the book Dragon Magic. Now, I honestly liked it. I thought it was cool, and if you're not sure what it means, it's basically a walking, talking flamethrower that specializes in using just breath weapon attacks like a dragon. Now, it starts out pretty balanced. You get a few d6 worth of breath weapon attack. You can do them as much as you want, 15-foot cone, 30-foot line, just spamming AoEs all day long. As they progress in levels, you get cool little tricks like using them underwater, or some bonuses to skills, or environmental kind of resistances. But by the end of it, you're just dealing buckets and buckets of d6, which is why it feels like 3.5 to me. You can maximize them, you can change the element. It's very powerful. But by that level, most other classes are doing the same amount of damage and or have the same survivability. So you're pretty limited in the fact that you'll focus on just doing area of effect and elemental damage, but that can be fine. So would I allow it in a game that I'm running? Well, if I was running 3.5, yes, I think I would. But I'm not worried about the overpowering of these classes, because as a good GM, I can always make a challenge that the party will just barely survive. Maybe even kill them if I roll lucky. As for the Dragonborn, I feel like there's a pretty clear line in the sand with some Dungeon Masters, and they like the classic fantasy races. They like the Tolkien races, dwarves, halflings, elves, humans, and the like. Things like the Dragonborn and the Tiefling became core races in 4th edition, which, as we all know, has plenty of stigma attached to it. Now, I understand the classic feel, and sometimes I will run games in a certain kind of setting where I only want the classic races, or maybe just humans and elves, or what have you, depending on the region. But overall, I really like the Tiefling and the Dragonborn. I mean, it's a fantasy world. If they're going to fight lizard men, they're going to fight kobolds. Why not let them play something similar? In fact, in my world, the Dragonborn aren't necessarily born from dragon blood. They are simply lizard men that happen to have a breath weapon ability. But dragons are also quite rare in my world, but we'll get into more of that later as we discuss things involving my world to answer questions. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. If I haven't gotten to yours yet, I will, and please submit more to d20questions@gmail.com. Till then, I'll see you on D&D memes.